9. February 1944. Off the coast of Nice, Mediterranean Sea. The fighter rolled through a clear winter sky, the horizon a measured line beyond the blue water, and First Lieutenant Robert Anderson Hoover felt the shudder through the control column just before the engine coughed and the canopy rattled with a sudden hail of metal. He had been flying cover for a formation that had already turned for home, a routine sweep that never felt routine, and the burst came from below and ahead, a quick climbing strike that cut the nose as if a saw had found the skin. He pulled to climb, felt the engine lose power, then tried to trim out the heavy wing as the aircraft began to slide. The altimeter dropped as 20mm rounds tore the cowling and cracked the oil line, and the propeller spun into a useless blur. He looked left and saw the curving line of the French coast and beyond that the ridges rising toward the Alps. And then he looked down and saw the water waiting. Training took over. He tightened the straps, dumped what fuel he could reach, checked the canopy latch, and picked a spot that was more instinct than calculation. When the aircraft struck the surface, it came in with a sideways slap and a hard bounce. And then he was under, fighting the straps. 3 seconds of blindness as the water rose and the cabin filled. He cleared the canopy, kicked free and came up with a gasp, his mouth filled with the taste of oil and salt. Somewhere above, the sky looked almost peaceful, as if the fight had never happened. He saw the dark shape of the aircraft sink past him, nose first, and then he began to swim. Minutes later, the shape of a German patrol boat came across the swells, a gray triangle with a spray of white water at the bow. He tried to make his hands still, tried to keep his legs moving. When the boat drew alongside, sailors leaned over and shouted in German. A rope came down and he grabbed it, his fingers slick with oil. He hauled himself against the hull while another pair of hands found his collar, dragged him up, and into the smell of diesel and cigarettes. Someone took his gloves. Someone else took his sidearm. He lay flat on the deck as the Mediterranean sun slid behind a passing cloud. In those first minutes, he counted his breaths and felt the heat of the metal under his cheek. Only later, on the run back to shore, did he think about what had gone wrong and what might come next. He had been in the air since he was a teenager. He had flown training planes that bounced on grass strips and fighters that pulled hard enough to make the world go gray. And he knew that the first rule after capture was simple. Breathe. Watch. Learn. Somewhere between the coast and the harbor at Nice, he decided he would not spend the rest of the war behind a wire fence. He did not know how he would avoid it, only that he must. When they put him on the pier, he was already counting guards, already counting steps, already memorizing the layout of the quay. The cold made his teeth ache, and still he counted. The day that brought him down was part of a larger rhythm that cut through southern Europe by the hour in 1944. Allied air units flew thousands of sorties across the Mediterranean and into southern France and northern Italy that month, opening lanes for convoys and training crews for the heavier strikes that followed. German radar along the coast watched these formations come and go, and fighter controllers rotated squadrons from airfields near Marseille and Toulon, and from Italian bases along the Ligurian coast, where fuel was increasingly scarce. In the first 2 months of 1944, Allied air crews lost hundreds of aircraft in the theater to flak, weather, and fighters, a steady tax paid in machines and men as the balance shifted toward the skies, belonging to the side with the deeper fuel tanks and the larger factories. The German state could still throw skilled pilots into the air, but the flow of aviation gasoline had begun to collapse under pressure, and the spare parts that once arrived on time by rail were now often weeks late or not coming at all. On the ground, in places like Nice and Genoa, German units moved prisoners through holding cells and barracks built for civilian police work, not long-term confinement, and then sent them by rail to collection points in the interior. Those trains moved on schedules that threatened to fail every day because of strikes, bomb damage, and shortages, yet they still moved. By the spring of that year, Germany held hundreds of thousands of Allied prisoners across Europe, with new camps or expanded compounds added as the fronts in Italy and the East shifted. The Luftwaffe maintained a separate network for aircrew captured from Britain, the Commonwealth, and the United States. And by early 1944, the largest of those compounds sat far to the north on the Baltic, near the town of Barth in Pomerania, where barbed wire ran in rectangles over sandy soil near the water, and winter wind blew from the sea with a flat, relentless chill. It was called Stalag Luftwaffe. By the end of the war, it would hold more than 8,000 Allied officers and enlisted specialists, among them more than 5,000 Americans. The camp had wooden barracks, brick stoves, a roll call square, machine gun towers, and a layout that looked simple until you stood inside it and understood that every angle had been measured for control. They moved him inland by truck at first, then by rail a day and a night and another day, with the car filling slowly with men who had been pulled from water or fields or roads where they had nursed wounds after bailing out. In the rail car, the smell was straw and damp wool and a little fear. He found that if he thought about the engine sounds and counted the turns, he could pass an hour without noticing the cold that crept under his collar. Somewhere near the Italian border, the guards unlocked the doors and brought in a pail of water and a sack of bread. When they slammed the doors again, darkness came down hard enough to make several men mutter. He slept against the wall and woke with a start when the train slowed for a long switch. Near dawn, the doors opened again, and the light revealed rough terraces, vines, and a small station with a wooden sign. He tried to fix the name in his memory, but the guard behind him urged them out with the flat command that needed no translation. The next transport went through Munich on a route that skirted the larger yards, which had been hit by bombers that winter, and were still clogged with wreckage. He saw the broken glass and the bent metal, and beyond that he saw cars full of coal still rolling on intact lines. It was a picture of a state that could take a beating and still enforce order, so long as the order was narrow and the beating was not yet mortal. North of Berlin, the air grew sharp and wet. When they finally stepped down at Barth, the sea was a line of iron in the distance. A breeze came in off the water and cut his ears musamus with a sting that reached bone. The march to the camp was quiet. Men walked with eyes down until they reached the wire. Then they lifted their heads to see the towers and the rows of barracks. Inside the gate, a Feldwebel ran a stick along the fence as if to make music and barked a string of syllables that ended with a laugh. "You will learn fast here," another guard said in serviceable English. The introduction ended with a shove and a door, and the smell of a room where damp had come up from the floorboards for months. He was issued a blanket and a number and a place to stand for roll call. That first night, he could not sleep. He lay on his bunk and tried to count backward from 1,000. At some point, before dawn, his eyes closed. He woke when someone bumped his foot and told him it was time to fall in for appel. By March, the routine had set into his bones. He learned the pattern of the guard shifts and the time it took for one man to walk from the east tower to the corner and back again. He learned the voices of the men in his barracks and could identify them in the dark as soon as they coughed or cleared their throats. Red Cross parcels arrived in lots that felt like treasures when they came, and like a missed heartbeat when they did not. The German rations were thin and tasted of turnips more often than anything else, and the parcels made the difference between strength and fatigue. He traded cigarettes for a tin cup that had not been dented too badly, and used that cup to mark out tea time on days when the wind made the stove sullen. He did not have a diary, but he kept a careful ledger in his head. He added lines for the stories men told at night when the talk got soft, and the guards were far enough away that the room felt almost private. The men in his room came from many places, from Boston and Oklahoma and Nebraska and Pennsylvania, and from towns no one in the room had ever heard of. He listened to an older officer from the Royal Air Force describe an earlier camp where the snow piled up against the wire and men had tunneled for months only to break through short of the woods. He listened to a navigator from California speak of a wife who had sent a photograph in which she smiled in a way that made several men look away. He learned to mend socks with a bent needle and to carve a spoon from a slat cut from a crate. He learned the value of rumor. Rumor made mornings tolerable and afternoons almost bearable. The Russians were at the Oder. The Americans were across the line at Casino. The British were planning an invasion in late spring. Fact kept pace with hope in the way of that year. In January, the Red Army had broken through west of Kiev and taken back hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. In February, the Italian front still held in fits and starts near Anzio, while the mountains trapped divisions in rain and mud. In March, the Allied bomber streams reached deeper into Germany, with thousands of sorties a week, and the fighters that had once been married to the bombers began to roam the skies on independent sweeps. For the men behind the wire, these facts came as numbers whispered on the roll call square, or as a scrap of newspaper, week-old but still bright with energy. The numbers felt like tools. If the Soviets were across the Dnieper in strength, the eastern camps would soon be moved. If the western raids grew heavier, the rail nets would falter and the warders would adjust. Every calculation ended in the same question. How does a man step through a fence that has been built by a state that knows how to build fences? By April, he had the beginning of an answer. In the evenings, he walked the perimeter with his eyes, not his feet, because the warning wire stood 18 feet inside the outer fence, and the guards in the towers grew jumpy when anyone lingered in that no-man's strip. He studied not the fence but the space beyond it, the open fields, the tracks that ran toward the little station, the line of trees to the north, the road with its shallow ditch. He thought about paths that did not require cutting. He thought about uniforms and language. He thought about the sea that lay to the west and the harbors where small boats might arrive on days when the wind would hide a motor. He also thought about airplanes. He had been thinking about airplanes since he was a boy in Tennessee, and he kept thinking about them now because even in a country that had lost much of its fuel, airplanes still moved. They moved by day in the hands of men who were still skilled and often brave, and they moved by night to bring officers from one place to another when the railways were uncertain. On a quiet afternoon, he stood near the end of a barracks and watched a Heinkel fly overhead toward the west. The sound of it brought a sensation of memory and hunger. He did not tell anyone what came to him then, because it sounded like fantasy, and men in camps have a way of killing fantasy to protect their own hearts. Later, very much later, he would tell a friend, and then he would tell more people, and a line would be quoted as if it had been born in a single instant. "I will just steal one of their airplanes." That was not bravado when it came to him first, not a joke told to win a laugh in a room of men who all missed home. It was a straight calculation. If the Russians kept coming, and if the guards grew nervous, and if a man could slip out during the confusion that always came with movement orders, then a man who knew how to start an engine and keep an aircraft straight with a dead crosswind might find a field where a German unit had left machines. Not a new machine with a full tank and a clean plug, but a machine that would run long enough to clear the trees. The idea seemed wild when he examined it piece by piece, but the pieces were all true. The countryside was full of small airfields. The guards would be pulled in two directions as spring moved to summer. The men in the towers would have to watch both the wire and the horizon. In that gap between their attention and his resolve, he saw a line that led away from the barracks. He began to watch more deliberately. He listened to the men who worked in the kitchen and the men who moved wood, and wrote down in his head the names of the guards who drank too much on Thursdays. He kept the idea quiet. He slept better after that, because a plan, even a thin plan, can hold a man together. The spring thaw came late that year. The wind off the Baltic still cut like a knife, and every morning the men stood on the roll call square stamping their feet to keep blood moving, while the guards checked numbers against a clipboard that always seemed to take too long to read. Robert Hoover stood with his hands at his sides and his eyes forward. But behind that calm he was studying everything: the angle of the nearest tower, the pattern of footprints near the outer fence, the moments when the guards turned their backs to light cigarettes. Each detail mattered. He had already decided that his chance, if it came at all, would come during confusion, and confusion only arrived when orders changed. The rumors now spoke of change coming from the east. Men said they could hear artillery on clear nights, and the guards sometimes looked up at the sound of distant thunder that wasn't weather. The Russians were moving west, taking cities the Germans had held for years. Whole divisions were being pushed back, and trains that once carried food and uniforms now carried wounded soldiers and refugees. The officers in charge of Stalag Luftwaffe knew this. They talked in clipped tones near the main gate and sent telegrams with more urgency. The prisoners could sense it without hearing a word. The air itself carried tension. By mid-April, Allied bombers were hitting German targets in waves that darkened the sky from morning to evening. The American 8th Air Force flew more than 27,000 sorties that month, and the smoke from oil refineries near Solon, Hamburg and Kiel rolled far enough to tint the sunsets over the Baltic. At the same time, on the Italian front, the Allied advance pressed north through Cassino toward Rome, and the newspapers that reached the camp, old copies of the Völkischer Beobachter used for wrapping or fuel, couldn't hide the desperation in their tone. Hoover read one such paper while sitting on his bunk, tracing the numbers of destroyed Allied aircraft that were clearly inflated. He noticed something else: a line about shortages of fuel and pilots. It meant fewer guards on airfields, fewer aircraft kept in full readiness, and more chaos in the Luftwaffe's logistics. If the war continued to tilt this way, even a small airfield might be left half empty, its defenses scattered. The idea that had begun as fantasy was beginning to find shape in reality. He started listening more carefully to the men who worked in maintenance details outside the wire, men assigned to chop wood, repair fences, or haul supplies. They came back with fragments of geography: a road running east toward Stralsund, a small landing ground near a cluster of barns, a group of German mechanics stationed there who were tired and underfed. Hoover stored these details silently, linking them together like pieces of a map. The Germans began preparing evacuation plans as the Red Army approached the Oder River. Orders were issued to move thousands of prisoners from camps in the east to prevent their liberation. Stalag Luftwaffe, situated in the north, was suddenly in a gray zone, too far west to evacuate easily, too exposed to leave untouched. By the end of April, guards began burning papers and crating supplies. Officers packed their offices with trunks that looked ready to move at a day's notice. For the prisoners, this meant uncertainty and opportunity in equal measure. Every day, new orders arrived and were canceled. Hoover watched as guards argued over maps. One night, 2 searchlights failed to come on at roll call. The next night, a tower stood empty for nearly half an hour before a new man climbed up. The discipline that had once defined German camp administration was dissolving under the weight of defeat. In another part of the camp, men tried digging again, but the ground was still half frozen and the tunnels filled with water. Hoover didn't bother with tunnels. His escape plan existed above ground, built on movement rather than concealment. He reasoned that if he could get free during the confusion of an evacuation and reach a nearby field, he might find what he needed: an aircraft. Any aircraft with fuel enough for an hour of flight. His own survival training had covered basic operation of German instruments. The thought no longer seemed insane. He had flown worse machines in training. The end came faster than anyone expected. On the 1st of May 1945, the prisoners woke to an eerie silence. No roll call, no shouted orders, no sound of engines near the gate. Men stepped outside cautiously and found the towers unmanned. A few guards remained near the main building, but they looked lost, as if waiting for someone to tell them what to do. Then, sometime after dawn, a German officer walked into the camp square, raised his hand, and announced in broken English that the war was over in the east, that the Russians were approaching, and that the guards were leaving. Within hours, the gates were open, and the men who had spent years behind wire found themselves free but surrounded by chaos. Hoover saw his moment. While others waited for the Russians or tried to organize transport, he slipped away with 2 other airmen who had worked on maintenance details. They followed the road toward Stralsund, walking through a countryside already stripped bare by retreating soldiers. The fields smelled of spring and smoke. After several miles, they reached a small clearing where they heard engines idling. 2 German mechanics running checks on a Focke-Wulf trainer left behind by an abandoned unit. Hoover stopped in the ditch and watched. He recognized the model immediately: a 2-seater with range enough to cross the Baltic if the weather held. The men approached slowly, hands raised. The Germans looked startled, too tired to resist. There was a short exchange in broken German and English. The mechanics wanted to go home. Hoover wanted the aircraft. Minutes later, the Germans walked away down the road and didn't look back. The 3 Americans checked the fuel gauge, the magnetos, and the control surfaces. Hoover climbed into the front seat and said quietly, "Let's go home." When the engine caught, the sound cut through the morning stillness like a heartbeat returning after a long silence. He slid the canopy back just enough to feel the cold air on his face, tested the rudder and the stick, and pushed the throttle forward in a steady sweep that brought the engine from a rough idle to a clean note that felt familiar despite the foreign gauges under his eyes. The grass field looked short from the cockpit, shorter still with a line of trees at the end and a shallow ditch that might catch a wheel if he drifted. And he reminded himself to keep the tail down until the last moment and then let it rise straight. He held the brakes, watched the needles settle, checked the magnetos a second time, and looked left to signal the 2 men who had come with him to step back to the edge of the strip. There was no radio call to make and no permission to seek. He opened the throttle and the aircraft began to roll, first slow, then with a rush that set the tail shimmying. He eased the stick forward, felt the tail lift, checked the drift, and kept the line straight with small steps on the rudder until the trees filled the windscreen and the wheels came alive under him. Then the weight fell away and the aircraft climbed. He reached for the gear lever by feel, found it, and listened for the change in pitch as the wheels tucked. He did not climb steeply. He kept the chioson, nose low and let speed build, then turned gently to the west, where the line of the Baltic ran gray under a low bank of broken cloud. For a minute he did not think at all. He only flew. The two men on the ground grew small and were gone. He was alone with an engine that was not his own, and an airframe that had been built to fight him. He felt no anger toward it. It was a machine and it wanted to fly, and if he handled it with care it would carry him out of danger. He checked the fuel gauge again and made a quick calculation that was more prayer than math. He would keep the coast on his right as a guide and then drop southwest when the water turned to an estuary and the land opened in the flat that led toward the Dutch border. He would fly no higher than 1,000 feet, unless he saw flak or fighters. He would trust that German radar operators were more concerned with the thunder rolling in from the east than with a single fighter skimming the waves. He thought of home, and then he stopped himself because home was too far and too much. He thought instead of a runway in friendly hands where he could roll to a stop and explain himself to men who might not believe a word he said. He scanned the engine dials again and listened to the note. The vibration in the pedals settled into a steady hum that seemed almost friendly. The sun climbed slowly behind the cloud, and the flat spring light made the water look like cold steel. What he did in that first hour was simple and exact. He held a heading with the coast to his right and kept his eyes moving across the instrument panel and the horizon. He had flown every kind of training pattern in Tennessee and Texas, in small planes with fabric skins and in fighters that had become extensions of his own body. He trusted those habits now because the situation demanded routines that would not fail under pressure. He also looked inland when a gap in the cloud opened and he could see the land. At intervals he saw trains, small plumes of smoke from engines that still moved despite the damage that had torn the lines all winter. He saw roads with thin streams of people heading west, and once he saw a long column of soldiers marching north in formation that looked taut enough to survive another month and yet tired enough to stop for any reason at all. He kept the aircraft low and felt the cool damp coming off the sea. Once he saw a barge moving under tug through the mouth of a river and noted the bearing in his head. When he crossed the line of that river, he felt the engine hesitate for a breath and then catch. He slid the mixture a hair richer and listened again. He could taste the fuel in the air and the oil on his lips, and he thought about the men who had built the engine in a factory that might already be a shell with part of a roof gone. The war moved so quickly now that events outran maps. He knew that on the last day of April, Soviet armies had reached the northern suburbs of Berlin and that Adolf Hitler had taken his own life there as the city burned. He knew that the German state was issuing orders that contradicted orders sent the day before. He knew that Field Marshal Montgomery had taken the surrender of large numbers of German forces in the north of the Netherlands and in Denmark just days later. The speed of those changes meant the air above the Baltic was both dangerous and strangely empty. The Luftwaffe had almost no fuel. It had scattered its remaining fighters in small groups to fields like the one he had left, places where fuel and ammunition had been promised and then never arrived. Allied air forces still flew many sorties, but with the fronts collapsing, ground units came first and strike packages followed them rather than roamed on the chance of a target that might matter. In that slack water between old lines and new orders, a single man in a captured fighter could slip along the coast and not be seen. He kept thinking about fuel. The gauges told a story in numbers, and he tried to hear the deeper story behind them. A Focke-Wulf could give him a range of several hundred kilometers on internal tanks if it had been serviced the week before and filled yesterday. He knew from the look of the field and the faces of the mechanics that the aircraft had been left in a hurry. He knew from the steady run of the engine that someone had cared enough to keep it in condition. He tried to build a court case in his mind, with evidence for each claim. The fuel line pressure held steady. The engine temperature sat in a range that anyone would accept. The oil pressure did not drift. He let these facts convince him that he could take another 20 minutes along the coast before he had to angle southwest. He did just that and kept the shore close. He passed a long stretch of marsh where the water met the land without a single break and decided he would not want to land there. He passed a fishing town where the boats lay idle at the quay, and a few men stood on the pier and watched him go as if they were looking at a bird that had lost its way. He wondered what they saw. A German fighter moving west over a sea that no longer belonged to Germany. A machine that had been built by their state and was now running away from it. He watched the sky and the sea and the wedge of land on his right, and felt the steady push that came from air moving over a wing at the right angle and speed. He tried to think about nothing else. The world in front of him was a strip of light and cloud, and the line where they met. He made small adjustments so that the engine never worked harder than it had to. He reminded himself to trim again whenever his foot began to feel heavy on one pedal or the other. He kept his body calm and his hands light. He did not talk aloud, but once he laughed quietly when a seabird rose from the water with an effort that looked like a man trying to run in a dream. He felt human again for a moment, and then he put the feeling aside because he would need it later, on the ground. The larger world below him kept its own schedule. In those days, the north of Germany was emptying itself of authority. More than 1 million German soldiers in the region that included the Netherlands, northwestern Germany, and Denmark were either in retreat or on the verge of surrender. Rail traffic had broken into fragments. Bridges were gone. The ports were clogged with ships that could not move for lack of orders or fuel. The Soviet advance from the east had pushed past the Oder and into Pomerania and Mecklenburg with hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of guns. The ground shook under that pressure, and the air carried the sound for many miles. The population that had remained in the towns near the Baltic saw soldiers fall back in columns that looked organized from a distance and ragged at closer view. Thousands of prisoners in camps along that arc had either been marched west or left in place when their guards vanished overnight. Stalag Luftwaffe had chosen the second course. The guards there had seen the figures from the east and had no wish to be present when Soviet units arrived. The men inside the wire had watched the machine that held them together come apart in a single morning, and then each man had to decide what to do with freedom delivered without warning. Some waited for the Soviet army out of caution. Some moved south toward the larger roads. Some, like Hoover, believed that speed was life and that it was better to ask forgiveness from a British or American unit after landing in one of their fields than to wait for someone to assign him a seat on a truck that would spend 2 weeks finding its way through wrecked roads. The numbers favored this calculation. The distance from the Baltic near Barth to the nearest Allied lines in the Netherlands was a little more than 400 kilometers in a straight line, and he could cover that distance in less than an hour if the engine stayed clean and the wind did not turn unfriendly. The risk of ground fire from a German unit that had not learned of a surrender in process still existed, but at low altitude he would pass before anyone had time to react. The risk of being met in the air by an Allied fighter was real, But the Allied air picture was controlled by controllers who could see traffic at higher altitudes, not a single fast dot near the deck. He was asking for luck, but he had given himself the best odds he could by planning a route that used the coast as a guide and then slid into Dutch airspace near a point where British and Canadian units had pressed close to the water. Near the mouth of the Elbe, he made his turn. He had run his finger along the edge of the canopy frame and felt a notch where paint had lifted. He had tapped the face of the fuel gauge as if that would shake loose a more generous reading. He had scanned the shore until he was certain that no flak site stood in his path. Then he banked gently and saw the sea slide to his left and the land open ahead, in a flat patchwork of fields and canals. This was the north of the Netherlands, a country crisscrossed with water and lines that man had drawn with patient labor. He felt as if the aircraft relaxed a little with him. The air over land had a different texture in spring than the air over water. It moved with thermals and small gusts that he knew well. He rode them easily and kept the aircraft level. After 10 minutes, he saw a line that could only be a proper runway and a group of buildings that looked like hangars. He came down lower to take a closer look and saw a flag at the far end that did not carry the German color. He saw vehicles where the sharp corners marked British design and a cluster of men who were already starting to wave, and for a moment he thought it was going to be easy. Then someone fired a burst from a position near the perimeter, and he saw the tracers cut the air in front of his wingtip. He pulled up a little, slowed, and rocked the wings to show intention. He could not talk to them, and he could not show his face clearly from this distance. He made a decision. He would land whether they welcomed him or not. He came around in a slow loop at pattern altitude and set up for a straight in. The field was long enough. The wind was light. He brought the throttle back, eased the nose up a hair to arrest the rate of descent, let the wheels find the ground, and then kept the stick alive while the aircraft rolled out with a noise that felt louder than any engine he had ever heard. He let the speed bleed down to a walk. He opened the canopy and raised both hands. He saw the nearest soldiers running toward him with rifles. He felt no fear. He felt only relief, heavy and clean in his chest. He shut off the magnetos, and the engine ran down slowly to a ragged cough, and then to silence. The world was suddenly very quiet. He could hear the calls of the men and the ticking of the cooling engine. He could smell grass and oil and mud. He climbed out slowly and stood on the wing with his hands high. A sergeant reached the wing first and shouted to get down. He nodded and lowered himself to the ground. 2 men took his arms. A third took the pistol from his belt that he had taken earlier only because it came with the aircraft. He said his name and his unit and the camp he had left that morning. He said it twice because the first time the words sounded like a story to his own ears. He looked around and saw roundels on a truck that told him the field was British. The British officer in charge arrived seconds later, looked him up and down, and then looked at the aircraft. Then the officer did something that Hoover never forgot. He smiled once and only with his eyes and said very quietly, "Well, that is a fine way to arrive." They took him to a small office by the field, where a pot of tea sat on a desk and maps lay under a glass sheet. He sat on a wooden chair with his hands on his knees and told the story again from the beginning. He started with the date of his shoot-down off the French coast in February the year before. He told of the capture and the movement to the camp by rail. He described the barracks, the roll calls, the Red Cross parcels, and the long winter nights when men tried to make the hours pass with talk. He told of the morning when the guards faded and the towers went quiet. He told of the walk to the field and the 2 mechanics, and the way the engine felt when it came to life. He told of the coast, and the turn, and the tracers on final. He did not leave out the fear. He included the calculation that had made fear useful. The British officer listened without interrupting. Once he asked for the names of the other two men and the place where they had parted. Hoover gave those names and the road they had taken and asked that someone be sent to find them. The officer nodded and made a note. Outside the window, men had gathered around the German aircraft and were inspecting it with a curiosity that was not hostile. They were soldiers and mechanics, and they respected a machine that could still run after the state that built it had let go of the wheel. The officer offered him a cup of tea and a biscuit. Hoover took both and found that his hands shook only a little. When he had finished, he felt a weight leave him. He was safe for the first time in more than a year. The numbers of the war continued beyond that office. In those same days, more than 2 million German soldiers were in Allied hands across all fronts. Cities that had once been spoken of with pride had become lists of shortages. The British and Canadians were administering food drops by air into Dutch cities that had starved that winter. American units were crossing into Bavaria and Austria. The Soviet armies were moving into Berlin and to the Elbe, where a meeting with American forces would seal the final line of this war in Europe. He was now a single soldier among millions whose stories were being sorted into piles called return and repatriation and demobilization. The war machine that had brought him to that chair turned with a steady rhythm. Trucks moved men by the 100. Ships moved them by the 1,000. Aircraft moved them by the tens of thousands in steady flights from airfields that filled entire counties. The scale dwarfed any single act. Yet the story of a man who had taken a foreign fighter and flown it to safety carried a human size that cut through the great numbers. Before nightfall, the British officer walked him back to the aircraft with a small group of pilots and crew chiefs. He wanted Hoover to show them the cockpit and the controls. Hoover climbed up again and sat in the seat. He pointed to the magneto switch, the throttle quadrant, the fuel selector, and the primer. He showed them the positions where the flaps lever would give takeoff, climb, and landing. He traced the path he had flown on a map that one of the men had brought out. He kept his language simple and made no claim to expertise beyond the hour he had just flown. He explained that the aircraft had felt sound and that the engine had run clean. He explained that the instruments were clear and that anyone trained on a basic fighter could learn enough to manage it in minutes. One of the British pilots looked at the fuel gauge, then at the tank caps, and then at Hoover. He whistled and said quietly that there had not been much to spare. Hoover nodded and felt the fatigue that comes when adrenaline leaves the bloodstream. The officer thanked him and said that transport would take him to a processing center in the morning. Hoover asked again that someone look for the two men who had walked with him to the field. The officer said that 2 motorcyclists had already gone along that road and that if the men were there, they would be brought in. Hoover went with a corporal to a small hut where a cot had been made. He took off his boots and lay down. He slept at once and deeply and without dreams, and when he woke just before dawn, he heard engines warming up on the field and felt the old desire to be a part of the day's business of flying. He sat up and stood and stretched. He had survived because he had kept a simple promise to himself that he had made on a pier in Nice when he was cold and afraid and trying to count his breaths. He would not let the war decide where he would end. He would keep control of the part of the story that a single man could still reach. In later years, he would tell this story many times. People would call the idea crazy in a way that meant brave and lucky and clever. He would correct them in a gentle way. He would say that the idea had been born from calm observation and the thin facts available to a man behind a fence. He would say that luck favored those who stood up when the gate was open. He would say that the machine had done its part, and that the men who let him take it had done theirs. That morning, with the spring air cool on his face, he thought only of breakfast, of a hot drink, of the sound of friendly voices, and of the long road that would carry him home across an ocean that was already filling with ships by the hundreds, under a sky full of aircraft that no longer needed to fire a shot. The British airfield near Emden, where Robert Hoover landed, was small, its runways lined with pierced steel planking that clanked under the weight of trucks and Dakotas taking off for repatriation missions. By the second week of May 1945, more than 13 million displaced persons, soldiers, prisoners, and civilians were moving across Europe in one direction or another. The British called it Operation Exodus. Hoover became one of those millions, his story absorbed into a vast, coordinated effort that stretched from the Elbe to the English Channel. For every plane taking off with freed prisoners, another returned with supplies for hungry towns. For every man like Hoover, who arrived with a story of extraordinary luck, there were thousands who simply stepped through gates and walked home through wreckage. The camp where he had been held, Stalag Luftwaffe, was officially liberated on 2nd May by Soviet forces. Photographs taken days later showed American prisoners still standing at roll call, smiling for the first time in years as Soviet soldiers looked on. Hoover's name appeared on the lists of liberated airmen compiled in London, marked as safe, returned by air. He stayed in England for a few days at an air depot near Bassingbourn, where the American authorities began sorting returning pilots by unit and medical condition. Every man was given a uniform, a medical check, and a form asking for an account of his capture. Hoover filled his in slowly, pausing at the question that asked how he had escaped. He wrote, "Flew out in captured German aircraft," and left it at that. When a clerk looked up in surprise, Hoover simply said, "It was the quickest way out." They photographed him holding a placard with his name and service number, like every other returning man, and then sent him onward by transport to the port of Southampton. There he boarded a Liberty ship bound for New York, one of hundreds making the crossing every week. On the deck, he stood among men who had fought in Africa, Italy, and France. Some had wounds wrapped in white. Some carried duffel bags stuffed with their entire wartime lives, and all watched the horizon in silence. It took 11 days to cross. When they reached New York Harbor, the ship passed the Statue of Liberty under clear skies, and men who had not spoken for hours began to shout and wave their caps. Hoover did not shout. He only stared at the skyline and thought of the thousands who would never see it again. The wider world into which he returned was still in motion. In the Pacific, the war continued with full fury. The Battle of Okinawa was reaching its final bloody weeks, costing over 12,000 American lives and more than 100,000 Japanese. Europe was free but broken. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne were flattened. Millions were homeless. In Germany, Allied military governments divided the land into zones of occupation, and former Luftwaffe airfields were being catalogued for dismantling or reuse. At the same time, Washington and London were compiling reports on every escaped or repatriated prisoner of war. The files described the structure of camps, the behavior of guards, and the routes of transport, all to prepare evidence for the upcoming war crimes trials. Hoover's brief account caught attention for its singularity. Few men had ever escaped a German camp by air, and fewer still by flying an enemy machine themselves. Yet he did not speak of it with pride. When a correspondent asked him about the flight, he said, "It was just a way home. I'd been looking at airplanes all my life. One of them happened to be my ticket." The comment ran in several newspapers under the headline, "American Flies German Plane to Freedom." To most readers, it sounded like a skull piece of wartime folklore, another tale of daring among thousands. To the men who had shared those barracks and counted the same fences, it was something more. It was proof that even in the last weeks of a war that had devoured nations, one man's knowledge and nerve could still carve out a small, impossible victory. He returned to his family home in Tennessee in the summer of 1945. The town held a parade that was more relief than celebration. Banners painted with names hung from telephone poles. Many were crossed out, some with stars drawn beside them for the men who would not return. Hoover walked behind a line of boys carrying flags and tried to smile. He weighed 20 pounds less than when he had gone overseas. His parents said little. His father, who had once built barn roofs and had never flown in his life, looked at him and said quietly, "You came back on a German plane?" Hoover nodded. "I did." The older man thought for a long moment, and then said, "Well, I suppose that's fitting. They built it to kill you, and it brought you home." In that single sentence lay the strange symmetry of the age. Machines that had been created for destruction, ending their lives as instruments of rescue. In the months that followed, Hoover found work as a test pilot for the Army Air Forces, which was now reorganizing into the United States Air Force. He flew every type of aircraft they could give him, from bombers to prototypes. Those who watched him said he seemed to have an instinct for balance, an ability to make a machine move as if it were alive. Years later, he would demonstrate aircraft before crowds, performing loops and rolls in routines that looked effortless. When people asked him about the day he stole a German plane, he would laugh and say, "I didn't steal it. I borrowed it to get home." The audience always laughed too, never knowing that the line hid months of hunger, fear, and calculation inside the wire at Barth. By the late 1940s, Europe was rebuilding, and the memory of captivity was fading under new worries. Occupation, rationing, and the beginning of tensions with the Soviet Union. The site of Stalag Luft 1 remained fenced for years before being cleared. Soviet authorities used it briefly to hold German prisoners, then abandoned it. The barracks rotted, the wire rusted, and the watchtowers fell. Only later, in the 1990s, did memorials rise there, with plaques bearing the names of thousands who had been held within its limits. Among them, one small inscription lists the names of the Americans who escaped before the camp's liberation, including Robert A. Hoover, pilot, U.S. Army Air Forces. Visitors who stand there today can still see the open field beyond where the Baltic wind moves through the grass. It looks peaceful now. No towers, no guards, no numbers called in the cold dawn. Just the wide horizon that once looked like freedom itself.